Hello there, and welcome to Forum Focus. I'm Wyatt Sharpe. Tonight, we are taking a step back from the daily noise of politics to instead talk about political power, how it's used, how it's misunderstood, and how history judges the people who have had it. When Canadians think about their prime ministers, we often reduce them to shorthand builders, managers, caretakers, and survivors. But the reality is far more complicated, especially when it comes to leaders who govern during moments of real political tension. One of the most debated figures in Canadian political history is John Diefenbaker, a prairie populist, a fierce defender of civil liberties, and a prime minister whose clashes with elites, institutions, and even allies left a lasting mark on the country. My guest tonight argues that Diefenbaker has been deeply misunderstood and that understanding his leadership tells us a great deal about the office of the prime minister itself more broadly. And joining me now to talk about all of that is Bob Plamondon. He is an author who has written extensively on Canadian prime ministers, and in this case, his most recent book, The Legacy of Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you here.
Pleasure to be on your show, Wyatt. Thanks for
Of
having me.
of course, let's just start out with kind of the foundation and maybe just you explaining a little bit about who John Diefenbaker himself was and kind of beyond the caricature, so to speak, that most Canadians remember.
So, John Diefenbaker was born in Ontario. Father was a school teacher. When he was a young lad, they moved out to Saskatchewan, and his father continued to be the leader of a one-room schoolhouse. And I would say that they were not in poverty, but they certainly did not have any, wealth to speak of. And here is a man or a boy at the time who has a last name that's Germanic in origin after the country had just gone through World War One. It certainly was not an advantage, and he, growing up, he felt um, not aligned with where Canadian public opinion was. Our
Mhm.
politicians, our heroes were from either English or French. There was not a place for those who came from a different heritage. And so that gave him this sense of the need for equality and the sense for justice. And it's why he pursued, a passion for the law, which was about creating equity and opportunity and equality. And in his practice of law, he was always defending those who were marginalized by society or who were victimized, the underdogs. And he was always sticking up for the little guy. This was in his origin. And this led to his natural attachment to the political scene, to affect change and to represent the views of a one Canada that he had always thought of. But I would say it wasn't an easy journey or an easy path into politics. In fact, he ran for elected office 5 times and went 0 for 5 before ultimately landing in the federal parliament in 1940, which was, the launch of his elected political career.
And you mentioned some of the numerous things that he did in the lead up and after his time as prime minister, but I wonder, with respect to kind of politically speaking, what happened when he was prime minister and why it is that his reputation remains contested in many ways, even obviously many, many decades after leaving office.
Well, there's a number of reasons why. So there's a few flashpoints that people, point to. Um, but let's just take it from the outset that he was always an outsider, not just an outsider to the political institutions and to the power brokers and to the money. He didn't come from an elite academic school. He was even, he ran for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party 3 times before, finally getting elected on his third try. So he was always someone who identified with what he said ordinary Canadians. And so when you're judging his character, people thought he was out of step in time and place. You had John Kennedy as president of the United States, this young, virile, modern, extremely articulate, president, and Diefenbaker looked
Mhm.
like a bit of an old, fuddy-duddy, and he didn't have that charisma. So and the journalists didn't like him. They saw him as kind of the, from the prairies, from small town, not having the intellectual underpinnings. And then there were, and the party should have loved him, and the party had lost 9 elections in a row. John Diefenbaker won 3 in a row, but he was still even somewhat despised within the power brokers within his own party. So he didn't have natural allies to defend his record, and there was, a couple of issues that people point to. One being the Avro Arrow. We can talk about that if you like, and also
Yeah.
the sacking of the governor of the Bank of Canada. So those are two things that people remember, but uh, they neglect to think about all of the things that he did that were really nation building projects.